the other half. Short story by John Jones. He stared out from behind the glass of a small frame, the picture taken 22 years ago as he stood on a beach, the sea behind him, beneath a cloudless sky. She wanted to feel emotion at his passing, wanted to shed a tear, but couldn't. He hadn't been a bad husband, and he certainly hadn't been good. Yet he had seemed to treat her as though she wasn't really there, someone he could fall back on for convenience. He had had many affairs, but Sandra always forgave him. It had come to the point where he would simply tell her he had been with another woman. He didn't fear any repercussions from her, because he knew she would forgive him. She didn't have much by way of anger, mostly frustration with no outlet, and he had exploited this for many years, using her reliability to get away with anything. Occasionally she had asked herself, "What do I see in him? Where was the man I fell in love with and married all those years ago? Who has this man become? Well, I don't like him," and to her disappointment, realized she didn't love him. Not anymore. It was a loveless marriage, unified by convenience, mostly for him, because he was basically a workaholic. Most of the time he was away, and seemingly only came home for respite. Off he goes to work all day as head of his car insurance agency, coming back for his tea, then going back out to nowhere you've ever been with his rich mates, she often wondered, drinking and getting up to all sorts, while you're sat in here watching your soaps and waiting for him to come in, sometimes hoping he didn't, because he brought nothing to the marriage anymore. Nothing whatsoever. He would sit in silence, reading his newspaper, watch sport on the television, and then he was out again, barely an acknowledgement to his wife. So she killed him. When he came home, he loved cups of tea, but never made it himself, just asked her to make it. He didn't even know how many sugars he took. He would look up at her from his newspaper and say, "Tea," and off she would go to the kitchen to make it. Make it your effing self, she would think, but she had never swore, and didn't even like to swear in her mind. They would barely speak, and Sandra had got to the point where she had stopped caring anymore. This quite upset her, because she kind of felt like a carer for him. Sandra often wondered what would happen if she just left, if, when he came home one day, there was a goodbye note on the kitchen table. "I've left you. The tea bags are in the brown container in the cupboard, the cups under the sink, and you take 1 sugar. The thought of her leaving would probably fill him with absolute dread. His first thought would probably be, "Who's going to look after me? What about my washing? My food? I can't cook. Maybe you'll just have to look after your effing self," she thought, and the thought of her having left would make him wither and die. And wither and die is what he did, because she finally snapped and poisoned his tea. Although she wasn't really a hoarder, she didn't like to throw away her old magazines and had a pile of them in the spare room. One of her favorites was one which featured all kinds of true-life stories, from murders to make-up tips, and one murder she remembered of a wife poisoning her husband because he gave her an ultimatum. "Me or the dog. Either the dog goes or I do." So she poisoned his beer. It told of the chemical and what it was found in, and that it wasn't too hard to get hold of. She had needed reminding, so dug out the magazine. Acrylamide, found in wheel shine spray for cars. A few droplets should do the trick, so she found a shop which specialized in gear for cars and motorbikes attached to a garage, bought a can of the spray, and when it came to his tea time, she sprayed a fair amount into his empty cup, more than a few droplets to make sure, then made the tea, and hesitated for only a few seconds. This is it, she had thought. Once she hands him the cup and walks away, she becomes a murderer. Yet Sandra did, and found it rather easy. However, she didn't want to watch him slowly die, and left the house for a 2-hour walk, cautiously coming back to find him lying on the floor, red-faced with bulging dead eyes. She dragged him into the kitchen, but was paranoid about him waking up, so got one of his rusty saws from the shed in the garden for the rare times he would decorate. Sandra asked herself if she was going mad. Do the insane know of their madness? As she felt she was heading in that direction, because, although her husband seemed dead, she wanted to make sure, so exposed his navel, placed the jagged teeth of the saw over it, and proceeded to saw him in half. Now he was buried in the garden, beneath a pear tree that barely gave any fruit anymore. Her hands filthy with soil, a spade lying nearby. She had laid a small picture frame and his glasses on the mound of soil, beneath which his corpse now lay. The glass in the spectacles reflecting the darkening sky and clouds, as though showing her where his soul had departed to. Beyond the clouds, into another world. There were no witnesses, the nearest neighbour being all of 50 meters away, around the curve of a country lane that led into the town, and eventually the town of Lindswood. Silence hung in the air, omnipresent, his absence noted by the very atmosphere and altered accordingly. The air was cold, blowing the weeds slightly and chilling her bones as though the angry ghost of her husband was standing beside her. Walking into the kitchen, she looked down at the place where she had used the saw, where his innards had spilt, where she found it hard to saw through his spine, where the blood carpeted the tiles and seeped into every orifice and cavity in the kitchen. It was all gone now, mopped and soaked up with towels and his clothes, but still there hung in the air the odour of blood, and the tiles would never be as yellow as they used to be. They now held a tint of ground-in crimson. She sat in his armchair and simply watched television for a while, not really taking anything in, staring at the screen, resting, barely moving. With the sky black as pitch, Sandra decided that she would make a hot mug of tea and take it to bed. The house felt empty, and to a certain degree, colder than normal. Perhaps it was because winter was drawing in, and the darkness crept across the land earlier each day, bringing with it a coldness that would cloak her and penetrate every bone. It meant that the bed covers at this point were an attractive proposition. That, and a large mug of tea. With the bedside lamp on, casting her and the bed in bright yellow from a pale lampshade, Sandra read her dog-eared paperback romance novel about a king's daughter obliged to marry a squire, whilst she secretly receives gifts and love letters from a secret admirer. After around half an hour, the mug empty on the bedside table, she put the paperback down after discovering who the admirer was. It was the gardener. She switched off the light and settled down, her mind surprisingly relaxed after what she had done. Perhaps it was the huge weight off her mind, the part of her psyche that worried and fretted over her husband, dying along with him. She also noticed the silence. It had never been this quiet before. There was no wind anymore, and no nocturnal animals to pierce the atmosphere. It was as though time itself had stopped in this area, and was perhaps deciding whether or not to stop her heart beating, as she had done to her husband. But soon there came a bang from somewhere that sounded close, and she wondered if she had been in some sort of half-conscious state. Did I hear a bang, or was it the remnants of a dream? The bang came again, like a door hitting against a wall or a kitchen cupboard. It was real, and sounded like the back door leading into the garden. Had Sandra looked out of the window with a large, powerful torch and trained it on her husband's grave, she would have seen a gaping hole. She heard a soft, barely audible sliding sound that changed to a rougher, coarser sound upon contact with carpet. Sandra wasn't afraid, just confused, her mind trying desperately to work out what it could be, and she remembered that she hadn't locked the back door, her mind elsewhere. Perhaps it was an intruding cat or fox from the fields. That had happened before. What else could it be? A burglar? But this far out. Unlikely. It crawled slowly along the hallway, leaving behind a trail of soil and slivers of flesh. Sandra realized that whatever it was coming up the stairs. It took a few minutes to reach the top, and continued to drowg closer, the sound increasingly louder. In the darkness of the bedroom, Sandra heard the door open. A slight squeaking sound came from the hinges. She had always meant to put a drop of oil on it, but most of the time, her mind never came close to even thinking about it. Nervously fumbling for the bedside lamp switch, she turned it on, and could not comprehend what was in the doorway at first. Something that crawled towards her, with a gaunt, white face and white, sunken eyes. The top half of her husband dragged itself slowly towards the bed, innards trailing, a rasping breathing issuing from its damaged lungs. Sandra was so frozen with fear, her vocal cords refused to work, her eyes wide and staring, like a rabbit caught in headlights. He disappeared from view at the foot of the bed, but then a hand appeared, grabbing at the duvet. It hauled itself up, and slowly crawled towards her, its white face cast even brighter under the glare of the light. Sandra did not know that he could not die, that he was immortal. His trysts and rendezvous that Sandra knew of, but not about, had resulted in a certain pact that he and several of his colleagues had achieved. Quincy, a name he had given himself, because he never liked Colin, had been part of a group, or secret society congregation. There were several such societies of varying sizes, each with their own regulations and rules. But this one he was a part of, there was only 8 members, so they could hardly call themselves a society, more a club or group. Yet, unlike the others, they were so secret that they didn't even give themselves a name. Most secret societies are not really secret at all, because by even giving themselves a name, they announce their existence. This was a group only 8 people knew about, and for a new member to come into the fray they would be secretly investigated and vetted that they could then be given morsels of information, and if they seemed keen to know more, if their interest was piqued, then they were asked to join, and so far all had said yes. Most societies have some sort of common interest or aim, or simply escaping from the outside world to indulge in riches, cheese, crackers and champagne. This society was certainly in that bracket, but with the inclusion that their main aim was immortality. All members would research throughout history, with however means, and perform the different methods and techniques that have been used to try and attain it, be it voodoo rituals, alchemic mixtures of all sorts of ingredients, or simply trying out their own spells and methods. They would philosophize, debate, and gave serious thought to cryonics, preserving themselves to be woken up in the future. All of them took it seriously, and none of them could ever really answer the question as to whether or not they really were immortal. They believed they were, and yet, by the same token, had their doubts. Maybe, just maybe, I'm not immortal. So the experiments continued, the spells, the rituals, until their founder, and the one who owned the golf club whose meeting rooms they met in each week, 84-year-old George Lawrence, decided enough was enough. He needed to know, and because he was the eldest member, took several tablets every day, and always had in his diary a doctor's or hospital appointment. He thought he would find out whether or not he was immortal. So, at one meeting, with all members present, George persuaded somebody to shoot him in the chest. They were very reluctant at first, but George thought that if he shot himself in the head, and he was immortal, he would have to live for eternity with half a head. At least if he shot himself in the heart, and he came back, that would guarantee it had worked. So with much debate and musings, the time came. He said his goodbyes to them all in case he didn't come back, and all raised a glass to him. They sat in a circle with George in the middle, having taken off his blazer and opening his white shirt. A housing and policy development officer pressed the barrel of a Colt .38 to his chest, where he guessed the heart was located, right against his sternum, and pulled the trigger, sending him crashing back from the wooden chair he was sat on. He had lain, sprawled on his back, unmoving, a bloody hole in his chest, an even bigger one on the exit wound, his heart practically having disintegrated, lying in increasing wet crimson. For a while there was silence. They all secretly guessed that he had gone, and wasn't coming back, until he slowly raised his head and smiled. Of all the experiments and rituals they had performed over the years, none of them knew which one had worked, which one had given them the opportunity to be immortal, and they all knew there was one task left to do before they embraced immortality. They had to die. In order to come back as normal as possible, without any blemishes, they needed to commit suicide without leaving any marks, so decided on strangulation. At least those marks were not immediately obvious, and they didn't know if they would remain or heal. So they fashioned a noose and took it in turns to hang themselves, and the nameless secret society continued to meet. For 3 years, Quincy had been immortal, and had not aged a second. So now Sandra had thought she had killed and buried him. But here he was, white, gaunt, dishevelled, smeared with soil, bits of which, as well as blood, had trailed behind him, and his upper half crawled across the bed to a wide-eyed Sandra who was about to scream. He reached out his hand towards her and said in a rasping whisper, "Help me."